Some people grow up in homes where love felt distant. Not absent, just quiet. Like a radio playing in another room, always there, but never loud enough to truly hear. If you were raised by Gen X parents, you might recognize this silence. Not cruelty. Not neglect in the obvious sense. But something harder to name, something like emotional absence wrapped in practical care. You were fed, clothed, protected, but not always felt. And that confusion, of having your needs met, yet still feeling unseen, creates a very specific kind of loneliness. The kind that doesn't scream. The kind that whispers, because how do you explain a wound that doesn't look like a wound? Gen X parents were raised in a world that taught them one thing very clearly: survive first, feel later. Many of them grew up in households where emotions were either dismissed or too overwhelming to safely express. So they adapted. They learned to become self-reliant early, to solve problems alone, to not ask for too much, to stay quiet when things felt heavy. That adaptation became their armor. But armor, when worn too long, doesn't just protect you, it separates you. So when they became parents, they didn't suddenly gain emotional language they were never taught. They gave what they knew. Structure, independence, space. Sometimes too much space. And for a child, space can feel like distance. Distance can feel like rejection. Imagine being a child standing at the edge of an invisible wall. On the other side is your parent. They're physically there. They show up. They provide, but when you try to reach them emotionally, when you're confused, overwhelmed, or quietly breaking inside, your hand touches something cold and unresponsive. You start to learn something without anyone ever saying it out loud. My feelings are too much. So you adjust. You become the easy child. The one who doesn't complain. The one who handles things alone. The one who senses when the room is tense and shrinks themselves to keep the peace. This is what psychologists sometimes call micro-trauma, not a single catastrophic event, but 1,000 small moments where your emotional needs went unmet. Moments so subtle they almost disappear. A dismissed feeling, a conversation that never happened, a hug that never came. Each moment on its own seems insignificant. But over time, they create something deeper, emotional erosion. Like water slowly wearing down stone, your sense of emotional safety begins to fade. And here's the painful part: you often don't realize it's happening. Because from the outside, everything looks normal. You had a home, rules, stability. But inside, something felt off. Like you were learning how to exist without ever fully being understood. There's also something called vague, ambiguous loss. A loss that doesn't have a clear ending or explanation. You didn't lose your parents in the traditional sense. They were there. But the emotional connection you needed was inconsistent. Unpredictable. Sometimes missing entirely. And the human brain struggles with that kind of uncertainty. Because it's easier to process clear pain than unclear absence. So instead of saying, "I didn't get what I needed," many children internalize it as, "There must be something wrong with me." That belief doesn't stay in childhood. It follows you. It shows up in relationships where you overgive, hoping someone will finally meet you halfway. It shows up in your difficulty expressing emotions, because you were never taught how to hold them safely. It shows up in the way you feel uncomfortable needing people, but deeply crave being understood. It's like growing up emotionally self-sufficient, but secretly exhausted from carrying everything alone. And maybe your parents didn't ask how you felt, not because they didn't care, but because no one ever asked them. Emotional language is learned. Connection is modeled. If they were never given the tools to process their own inner world, how could they guide you through yours? So instead, they might have said things like, "You'll be fine," or "Just deal with it," not realizing those words taught you to suppress rather than process. Over time, you build what feels like an invisible rule book. Don't be too emotional. Don't be too needy. Don't expect too much. And without realizing it, you begin to parent yourself. But here's the paradox. A child who learns to parent themselves too early often grows into an adult who doesn't know how to receive care. Because receiving requires trust, and trust requires the belief that your needs matter. And that belief was never fully planted. So instead, you become hyper-aware. You read between the lines. You sense moods. You anticipate rejection before it happens. You become emotionally intelligent, but not emotionally safe. It's like living with your guard up, even in moments that should feel calm. Because deep down, there's a part of you still standing at that invisible wall, wondering if anyone will ever reach back. And maybe the hardest part is this. You don't hate your parents. In fact, you understand them. You see their struggles, their limitations, the world they came from. And that understanding makes it even more complicated to acknowledge your own pain. Because how can you feel hurt when you know they tried? But pain doesn't disappear just because it's understandable. And emotional absence doesn't stop affecting you just because it wasn't intentional. There's a quiet grief in realizing that love was there, just not in the way you needed it. And that grief often stays unspoken, because it doesn't feel valid enough to say out loud. So you carry it silently. You become strong in all the ways that look impressive from the outside, but inside, there's still that question echoing. Why did I feel so alone, even when I wasn't? And maybe the answer isn't simple. Maybe it lies somewhere between survival and silence, between what was given and what was missing, between a generation that learned to endure and a child who needed to feel. And right at that intersection, something important begins to surface. Not blame, not anger, but a deeper question that changes everything. What if the way you learned to survive is the very thing that's now keeping you stuck? What if the very strength that protected you is now the thing that keeps you distant from the life you actually want? Because survival has a cost. When you learn to silence your needs, you don't just silence pain, you silence joy too. When you train yourself not to depend on anyone, you don't just avoid disappointment, you also block connection. And over time, this creates a life that feels controlled, but quietly empty. You become the one everyone relies on. The stable one, the strong one, the one who has it together. But no one sees how tired you are of always being that person. No one sees how difficult it is to say, I need help, without feeling like you're breaking some invisible rule. How uncomfortable it feels when someone tries to get too close. How your first instinct is to retreat, to handle it alone, to go back to what feels familiar, even if that familiarity is loneliness. This is the hidden consequence of emotional self-reliance. You don't just carry your own weight, you carry the belief that you have to. And relationships start to reflect that. You might find yourself drawn to people who are emotionally unavailable because it feels normal. Or you might push away the ones who are available because their presence feels unfamiliar, almost suspicious. It's not that you don't want love. It's that love, when it's consistent and safe, can feel foreign to a nervous system trained in emotional distance. So you hover between two worlds, wanting closeness, but fearing what it requires. And sometimes, you don't even realize you're doing it. You just feel the pattern. The slow pull away, the hesitation to open up, the instinct to downplay your feelings, and underneath all of it, a quiet belief. If I need too much, I'll be too much. But here's where something begins to shift, because what once protected you was never meant to define you. That version of you, the one who stayed quiet, who adapted, who learned to survive in emotional silence, that version deserves understanding, not judgment. They did exactly what they needed to do in order to get through. But you're not there anymore. And the rules you learned back then don't have to be the rules you live by now. Healing doesn't begin with blaming your parents. It begins with seeing the full picture. They were shaped by their own invisible walls, their own unmet needs, their own emotional deserts. And in many ways, they gave you what they never had, but they also passed down what they never healed. And now, without realizing it, you've been carrying both. The strength and the silence. The resilience and the distance. So the question becomes, what do you keep and what do you gently let go? Maybe healing looks like allowing yourself to feel something fully without rushing to fix it. Maybe it's noticing when you instinctively say, "I'm fine," and pausing, just for a moment to ask yourself if that's actually true. Maybe it's learning that needing people isn't a weakness, it's a part of being human that was never meant to be shut off. And maybe, slowly, it's about letting someone in, not all at once, not perfectly, but just enough to remind your nervous system that connection doesn't always lead to loss. Because safety can be relearned. Not in grand, overwhelming changes, but in small, quiet moments. A conversation where you say a little more than you usually would. A boundary where you honor your own limits without guilt. A moment where you choose to stay, instead of retreat. These are the ways you begin to rebuild something that once felt impossible. Trust. Not just in others, but in yourself, and it won't feel natural at first. In fact, it might feel wrong. Because you're stepping outside of a pattern that kept you safe for years. But discomfort doesn't always mean danger. Sometimes, it means growth. Sometimes, it means you're finally doing something different. And slowly, that invisible wall you once felt begins to soften. Not disappear overnight. Not crumble all at once. But crack, just enough to let something through. A little more warmth, a little more connection, a little more of you. And maybe one day, you'll look back and realize something quietly powerful. You didn't become less strong by opening up, you became whole. Because strength was never meant to mean doing everything alone. It was meant to mean carrying yourself through. And allowing others to walk beside you. So if you've spent your life being the one who never needed anyone, maybe this is your permission to need, just a little. To feel, just a little. To believe, even if it's unfamiliar, that your emotions are not a burden, they are a bridge. A bridge back to yourself. And maybe, for the first time, you don't have to stand at that invisible wall anymore. You can step forward. You can reach out. And this time, someone might actually reach back. If this story felt like it was speaking directly to a part of you you've never been able to explain, then maybe that part is ready to be heard. And if you're still here, still listening, still searching for something that feels like understanding, then you're not as alone as you once thought. Sometimes healing doesn't start with answers. Sometimes it starts with recognition. And if this moment gave you even a small sense of that, then maybe you're already closer than you think. If this story resonated with you, you are not alone, and there are more quiet truths waiting for you right here.